Hi everyone, and welcome to the Storm webinar brought to you by Haven Knox-Johnston, Euro Marine and Premier Sailing. My name is Paul Knox-Johnston. I'm the Sales and Marketing Manager for Haven and Euro Marine, and I'll sort of be guiding you through. Basically, when we were putting into this webinar together, three sort of separate sort of headings came up, and we're going to be going through those in an order. So what happens when you've left your boat ashore or afloat in a marina or on its permanent mooring? Then if bad weather is forecast and you are able to make it to port and temporarily moor there, what should you do? Or if bad weather is forecast whilst you're out at sea. So we've got in three sort of distinct sections. Right, now on to our expert panel who'll be joining me. We have with us today Colin Stracey, the owner and principal of Premier Sailing School up on the East Coast. Colin has been sailing since he was about 10 years old, was in the Merchant Navy and is now, as I say, Yachtmaster instructor based up on the East Coast. We also have, for more technical insurance-based questions, we have Carl Davis, the claims manager from Haven Knox-Johnston, who has been in marine claims for about 40 years, if I'm correcting that, Carl.
That's right, indeed.
So there's probably very little he doesn't know about marine claims. So for more technical and insurance-based questions, we've got Carl on board as well. Without further ado, so the first section, as I said, is what happens if your storm hits while you have moored your boat up. It's on its berth in the marina, or it's ashore in a marina, and you know it's winter, so you're not really using it. So the first section is all around about that sort of area. So what we'll do is we'll start off with what happens if your vessel is ashore, and what the best practice is. And Colin.
Okay, well, in the marina where we are, I don't know where these pictures were taken, but if the boat can be in a cradle on level ground and stable ground as well, that is useful. You need to be aware of windage and things like that. If it's braced on props, as the bottom picture is, then particularly if there's bad weather approaching, most mariners will send someone around just to put the wedges in and give them a bit of a tap with a hammer just to make sure that all the boats are safe, because if one falls over, it's likely to be several as they touch each other. So it's good as a boat owner to go around and just check that your boat is safe. You can't just leave it up to the marina.
And also, I suppose the one thing that I've seen on a few occasions is where people are trying to re-anti-foul their boats and they sort of move the chocks around. That's probably not advisable either, is it, Colin?
Certainly not. It could ruin your next season.
and as we can see from the next slide, this is obviously what could happen if it does go wrong. I mean, this is not unheard of. I mean, we're hearing this more and more frequently. I mean, is there anything that the people can do? Should they be constantly checking it? Should they be talking to their marina? Or is there anything they can do on that side of thing, Colin?
I think they should talk to the marina. In this case, it looks as though the cradle was too small for the vessel, but also we can't see off to what's on the other side of it. But if it's exposed to the weather, then it could well be that the wind pushed it over. It does look as though they had dodgers or a canopy up as well. So there was a case actually in a marina not far from where we are in Essex, where because there was strong wind coming and the boats were exposed to the weather, the marina owner put a JCB to the end boat and tied it to it so that it would be a bit safer than just leaving it on its own. So there are things people can do or the mariners can do to stop boats toppling over if the wind is too strong. But I think the cradle on this one looks a bit small for the boat actually.
And we would assume that sort of it's the marina that chooses the cradle, it's the marina that lifts it in there. Then it's a conversation to have with your marina in the first instance on that sort of thing. So, but obviously not all boats are kept ashore. They are obviously kept afloat. This is a quite extreme example there. But yeah, what advice can you give to boats that are sort of kept afloat, Colin?
Well, I think making sure that it's tied up properly, the fenders are in the right place. Whoops. So I was going on to the next one, but it seemed to have gone back. Here we go. So one of the things that we found here is that the left-hand sketch shows how most people would tie up their boats, but you get chafe where the ropes go through the fairlead, and so we've had a couple of instances where 3-strand nylon ropes or polypropylene ropes have broken where they go through the fairlead. So one of the options is to use the system that we've got on the right-hand side here, where there's less chance of chafe, the ropes going in a nice straight line. The other thing is that it might be wise to put extra ropes on if bad weather is forecast, but there's no point in putting it all to the same cleat. Even the cleats on the pontoon, it might be a 10mm bolt that's holding the cleat in place, or it might be in an aluminium groove. You really need to spread the load across several cleats rather than just the one cleat on the pontoon. And one way to stop chafe is to wrap something around the warp. So we have a bit of plastic pipe that's got a slit lengthways along it that we can slip over a warp, particularly if we're using something that's going over the top of the anchor roller. So we would always say put something around where it goes through the fairlead and across the deck to stop chafe. And tie a boat up properly. Believe it or not, this has been tied up with or by a sailing instructor, and he's used the warp going to the rigging. You really do not want to tie the boat up to the rigging. Any damage to the rigging could result in rigging failure later on. So it's most important that you tie the boat up properly with springs and to proper cleats rather than, as I say, to the rigging or to stanchions and the like. They're not designed to take the load. And it's good practice to tie up with something or a knot that you might be able to undo under load. So in this case, the 3-strand nylon rope is tied on with a round turn of 2 half hitches, which can be undone under load so that you can move the boat about, particularly if fenders pop out, or maybe the rope stretches a bit in strong winds from the stern and you're starting to bang the bow. So you can, that one you'd be able to undo, and with a bit of help probably pull the boat back. Whereas the cat's cradle over the top of the bit of knitting there on the cleat with the blue rope, it's got a locking turn on it. It might be difficult to undo that, and I have no idea where the slap rope has gone, but it could be difficult to undo that. And then it's the positioning of fenders, really. If you have the fenders slightly too high, then if the boat heels with the wind, the fender can pop out. Alternatively, we've seen a few cases where fenders have gone underneath the pontoon, and then of course the boat can't come back up. In this case, we don't know what's happened, but it's been rubbing, something has been rubbing against the hull. Now this boat has got fender covers on and they look lovely, but if you don't keep them clean, then grit gets in them, particularly if you've been up against a wall or piles, and then they rub on the hull and actually do surface damage just like this one. And so the positioning of fenders is key.
And Carl, just on that one, just for the one, if this damage is caused by a singular event such as a storm or something like that, then that's obviously covered by insurance. But if it's an ongoing thing that's been going for many months, then that's sort of maintenance and wear and tear thing, isn't it?
Yeah, if it's happening over a period of time, general wear and tear, then obviously that's not something that's covered. But through one event, a storm event, then that damage would clearly be part and parcel of the claim.
Thank you. Colin.
Okay. So one of the key things with when the boat's moored up is to make sure that it doesn't have too much windage and that things are safe. In this case, the genoa has partly rolled out. You can see the damage to the sail, but you need to make sure that the sail is, if you're leaving it up because you're going to use the boat, it's rolled up properly, it's not baggy, that the furling line in particular is not just left on a winch or on a jamming cleat, it's actually cleated off properly so that it just cannot come loose. We had a case here in the marina where we are where the genoa rolled out, not in particularly strong wind in fact, but the genoa rolled out, backstay gave way and the mast came down. So it's very, very important that the genoa is stowed away properly. If you're going to leave the boat over the winter, and particularly if it's ashore, you must take the genoa off to prevent anything like this happening, because it would definitely take the boat over. Similarly, it might be that you do the same with the mainsail. You take it off, lower the windage and any dodgers and things like that.
And what about canopies and things like that?
Well, I think we have a slide about those in a second, don't we? There we go. So I would always, if I'm leaving the boat, take the canopy down, and if it's been left for months, then you want to protect it from the weather and getting mildew and all that sort of stuff. So I would actually take it off and take it home. If I'm going to be using the boat over the winter, as personally as we do, then we fold it down, and most of them have a series of straps that you can tie it down with, and that's what we would do, is tie it down. I don't know what happened in this case, but we do have experience some years ago of we had a particularly large amount of snow, and a big lump of snow fell off the radar on a centre cockpit boat, and it demolished not just the spray hood but also they had an enclosure, and we were moored next to them, and then when the snow melted, the cockpit filled up with water and they had shut the cockpit drains, and fortunately ourselves and some other people who were around were able to empty the cockpit because the people were abroad. But it is quite important to make sure that your boat is safe, and it's awkward if the cockpit drains are not left open.
And it's such a simple thing, isn't it? Just to sort of grab a sail. If you push it, in this case, you push the spray hood forward, or you've got the genoa, just to get a sail tie, just very simple thing to do which actually could save a lot of damage.
Yes, in fact, I've forgotten that point. On my notes, we put a sail tie through the clew of the sail and then tie it around the rolled up genoa just to make sure it doesn't come loose. A lot of people leave the sheets loose, but if the sheets are loose and the sail's not tied up, then the wind can get in between the rolls of the sail and make it billow out, and as I say, can cause quite a lot of damage. And if a sail is left flogging for any length of time, there are cases where it's pulled the genoa track off the deck, and also could damage people. Trying to tame a sail in strong winds is quite hazardous.
And yet so simple to sort of sort out in a way, isn't it? I mean,
it's simple to prevent. Okay. Oops. There we go. Now this is you know more about this, Paul, than I do.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at this video, what you can see here quite clearly is, one, apart from the chap's not wearing any shoes, which is slightly concerning me right now, is you can see the mast in the background, but just behind the fender. What's happened here is a boat has sunk between two moored boats. They're both stern to moored. The guy's got the fender out there, obviously, to prevent any damage to his boat from the mast swinging from side to side. I mean, again, apart from the fact that the shoes is slightly concerning me, I seem to be fixating on that at the moment. I mean, what else? Is there anything else that this guy could be doing in this situation, Colin?
Well, I wouldn't have liked to have been in his situation, certainly. The ideal would be to remove yourself from the situation and take the boat out to sea. But this, in fact, is a motorboat, and with the boat sunk next to him, you don't know what's underneath. And so I think he's doing the best that he can. And if it's stern to mooring, this is in the Med, so I can see that he probably didn't even take any shoes with him, let alone a life jacket. So it's, I think he's in a very awkward situation. He's doing the best that he can to protect his vessel. And that's, in a situation like this, that's all you can do, really.
Mm. I mean, it is. You've got to act as though you've got to act in the best interest of the vessel. Forget all the insurance sort of aspects to it, and forget all that sort of thing. You've just got to do what you can to protect your vessel, really.
Yes. Yeah.
And then I think we've got the aftermath in the next picture. As you can see quite clearly what's happened, where the boat's gone down, the motorboat on the right hand side there. Yeah, I mean, this is an extreme set of circumstances, but again, it's one of those things that could easily happen in any of the storms that are sort of coming through us at the moment.
Yes, and again, we've got a little bit of Genoa that's come out on the sailing boat next to the one that's sunk and has been shredded. And the other thing about the Genoa is, if you haven't got it rolled up nice and tightly, it could be that there's a bit left out. So it's good practice to have a roll or two of rope on the furling drum, just to be able to tighten it up should this happen.
And Carl, I know we don't want to talk about specific sort of specifics in this, but just looking at that picture there, where would liability lie for the boat that's I mean, I would think that the liability for the damage to the two boats either side is obviously in the cause of the boat in the middle, but depending on what happened, of course, where does liability lie?
Well, in these circumstances where the weather is so bad, it's almost impossible to prove negligence against the owner of the sunken boat. So he wouldn't necessarily be liable for the damage to the other boats because of the extreme weather conditions. So each insurer would pay for their own damage.
They'd pick up their own tab on that one.
That's right, yeah.
Thanks, Carl.
I think they call that knock for knock in car terms, don't they?
I think you're right there, Colin, yes. And then the next, yeah.
Okay. So this is just good practice, really, not to have the masts next to each other when you're rafted up or moored next to another boat. So we would always endeavour to try and have the mast staggered, particularly if we're going to raft up next to another boat. It only takes a motorboat to go racing past, and all the boats bounce next to each other. So it's good practice not to have the masts adjacent to each other when you're mooring up close to somebody else.
Okay. So now we sort of covered off the sort of the when you are moored and all that sort of thing. What we're going to move on to is now a storm is forecast. What should you do, Colin?
Okay, well, I can't remember, but I think it was Spike Milligan that said that the best place to ride out a storm is in the pub.
I'll disagree.
So this picture was actually sent to me by a friend, and it does make me giggle a bit. Not because the poor chap's boat is bouncing around against a quay. The giggle is that the comment that came from the person my friend who sent me this was, he's left his boat with the ensign on. I think that was the least of his worries, really. But what is interesting about this is that he's doing his best to save the vessel from being damaged. He's got his fenders out. He's on a well-fended quay with tyres and one thing or another. But also he's put ropes out to an anchor to hold the boat away from the quay. And that's quite good practice if you're exposed somewhere. So that's quite good, really. Although my screen has gone, oh, here we go. This is a harbour master collecting his fees. But these things can happen. And if you're going to anchor out somewhere and the forecast is not quite so good, you do need to make sure that you know how much water there is. This is actually a slide that's taken from a day skipper course, and it's good practice to do a manual tidal calculation. Don't just rely on your electronics. It could well be that there's a slight difference, and that slight difference could be fundamental between surviving a storm and not. So we've had a couple of occasions where the electronics have been very different from, by half a meter or more from the manual calculation, and always take the worst case scenario. So you need to know how much water you've got under you if you're anchoring or even berthing. And this picture is, I understand, is relatively famous, but this has actually happened to us. My wife and I crossed the Wash and went into Wales next to sea, and we obviously asked the wrong question, because I said to the harbour master, when we dry out, is it level? And he said, oh yes, it's level. So that was the wrong question, because what I should have asked was, is it horizontal? Because we woke up to hear people talking, saying, oh, look at that boat, aren't those ropes tight? Is it going to be all right? And then we realised, as the boat was leaning away from the pontoon, that they were talking about us. And the ropes were bar tight, and our own boat is a bilge keel, and one keel was on the ground and one was in midair. So you do need to make your own judgments about these things as well.
And Colin, on this one, how would you get out of it, or is it just literally waiting for the tide to come back in again and then you can slacken off the lines, I suppose?
Well, I would say you're going to have to wait. We actually got off the boat and put extra lines to hold her up, and a bit like this one actually in a way, although we put them to the cleats on the opposite side. But cleats are not designed to take the load vertically, they're designed for horizontal load. So you might want to perhaps use a rope underneath the boat perhaps, and like this one has been done. But on a bigger boat, that's very awkward. So I would just get off and wait, and hope that it's going to float again it will float again when the tide comes back in. If we're anchoring, it could be that we put 2 anchors out, and if the weather's bad, we would have to have an anchor watch, so we watch what's going on to know that we're safe and we're not dragging. I've got a friend who was in the Scilly Isles, and for the first time ever, his anchor dragged. You do need to make sure you leave enough chain out, or enough rope and chain. And although in the textbooks it will say 4 times the depth if it's chain, or 6 times the depth if it's a mixture of warp and chain, the issue here is chain doesn't do any good sitting in the anchor locker. So the more chain you have out, the safer you're going to be. 2 anchors is good. If there's a strong tide and you're swinging about too much, it could be that you increase the drag a little bit to stop you swinging. So you drop a bucket on a rope over the back or something like that, or a small drogue. The other way, and I've done this myself, put 2 anchors out in line with each other, so one's dropped down the anchor chain on a bit of rope, and that will definitely increase the holding power. The anchor only works if you pull horizontally, so the more weight you have along the chain, the better it's going to be. An anchor chum can help with that, and it doesn't have to be, something that you buy for £100 in a Chandler's. It could be an old oil can full of stones. I was chatting, someone asked me the question the other day, well, what if you haven't got an anchor chum or a can to fill with stones, you're caught out, what are you going to use? And this particular person said, well, I've got a microwave. I don't know how safe that will be. But actually, I looked in my locker last night, and I've got a massive bag of old shackles. Never throw anything away. Got a great big bag of old shackles. I could use that. You drop it down the anchor chain on a rope, get it so it's either just above the ground or just touching the ground, and that will increase the weight on the chain and help the anchor to hold. This one is just showing a picture of a snubber. A lot of people use a snubber to hold the chain. If the weather's bad, by all means use a snubber, but it'd be better to use a piece of rope, clove hitch around the chain and bring it up to both cleats. So rather than have a snubber on one cleat, which is the traditional way, which is shown here, if you have a piece of rope through either fairly attached to a cleat with a clove hitch around the chain, it will stop the chain clanging and banging, but also it will spread the load across two cleats and is a bit safer. Over to you, Paul.
Yeah, and now we move on to where you're on a cruise. Heavy weather has just been forecast down across the radio, and now you what to do in this situation, whether you sort of stay out or head into port, or what's the sort of best advice for that, and if you are caught out, what should you be doing?
Okay, well, there's no right or wrong answers to some of these. Sometimes you have to wing it a bit. But what's interesting is that the number of people I've spoken to who have a set of storm sails and have never ever taken them out of the bag, and if the worst came to the worst, wouldn't know how to fit them. And we have an emergency forestay on one of our boats, and we did an exercise just a few months ago of rigging it, and in between different skippers being on the boats, the emergency forestay flaps about a little bit when it's not being used, and so they had adjusted it and tightened it up so it didn't flap about. When we came to then have a go at fitting the storm sail, we found that the emergency forestay wouldn't meet its strong point on the foredeck. So you do need to be particularly careful if you are chartering a boat or something like that. If you get caught out, before you go, check that the storm sail does fit and that the emergency forestay fits. It's too late if you've already if you're caught out in bad weather to try and work out how they fit. They should have sheets on them in the bag as well, so that you don't have to try and take a genoa down, roll, and take the sheets off and then refit them. The other thing is that these days we have very reliable engines, and so one of the techniques that's used more often than not now is to put the engine on, have the minimum amount of sail out just to keep the boat stable and not rocking about too much, and use the engine to control the direction and going up and down the waves, rather than try and just sail. So storm sails work, but you might be limited in the direction you can go. So quite often it's good practice to have the engine to help control the vessel.
And I'm sorry, Colin, what's the equivalent of that for a motorboat, things like that? You obviously don't have storm sails, but you've got, if you're caught out again in a situation, is there a different set of rules for a powerboat?
Well, particularly if you really don't want to get caught out in a planing type powerboat, it really is gut wrenching because you have to slow down quite earlier. Sailing boats can handle bad weather much better than a powerboat, and so you have to have the minimum speed necessary to have steerage way. Really, a powerboat is much more likely to reach kind of survival conditions earlier than a sailing boat. But what does work is having a sea anchor or something like that and just riding it out. In really bad weather, it's better to be out at sea than it is to be trying to enter a harbour. And particularly with a motorboat, I think it's going to be extremely uncomfortable. I wouldn't want to be there, to be honest. I've been on a ship in very bad weather, and that wasn't very nice. So it's in fact we laugh about it, but I was on a bulk carrier and my wife was with me at the time, and the front of the vessel, as it came up out of the water, was still turning away from the wave when the back was going the other way, the stern was going the other way, and you could see the middle of the vessel twisting. And I was decidedly nervous. She thought it was really exciting, having never seen it before. But I did make sure the life jackets were next to the bunk when we went to bed after my watch. So it's yeah, powerboats are not very good in bad weather.
Just a question has just come in, just to sort of clarify what you just said. Did you say it was better to be at anchor if you're on a motorboat, or drop a sea anchor? I think it was, wasn't it?
It was. I was going to say, I'll come to it in a slide in a minute, but I would say if you're in deep water, away from land, drop a sea anchor over, make sure it's far enough away from the boat that it's always under the water, and just ride it out.
And the sea anchor, I think, is on just to explain the sea anchor, that's on one of your next slides, I think.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So sometimes if the weather's bad and you're sailing along, it might be that you're going too fast. So you surf down a wave, the rudder comes out in the water, you lose control. So a drogue from the stern will slow the boat down so that you can have more control. And you wouldn't want the engine going at this time, because you don't want to, as it goes slack, you don't want it rope around the propeller. Propellers seem to have rope magnets, but it's good practice to slow it down. And it doesn't have to be a drogue. It can be just lots of warps thrown over the back. And in Robin Knox-Johnston's book, when he went around the world the first time, there is quite an interesting bit where he put warps over the back to slow the boat down, and it does work. We've had a bit of a play at doing this, and it certainly slows the boat down dramatically, just throwing bits of rope over the back, tied on obviously. So it's good practice. But also, just like with the storm sails, if you have a drogue, you do need to go out at some point and try it out. It doesn't have to be bad weather, but you do need to try it out and know how to fit it. Where the rope goes over the stern, you're going to want to wrap things around it to stop it chafing. And just in this picture, it needs to be far enough away from the boat that it's always under the water. So that might be 100 meters. And it's good practice to have a tow rope of about 100 meters as well. So the warp that you get for that, you can double up as a tow rope. And then when it's really bad, a sea anchor. Now I have to be honest and say the only time I've ever set a sea anchor is as a practice. I've never been out in weather bad enough that I've needed to do this. But a sea anchor does work. It slows the boat down dramatically, and it keeps you head to wind. The wind is what makes the waves, so it keeps you head to the waves. So it might be really uncomfortable, but you will be safe. And I think lots of people talk about the Fastnet race in 1979, but the use of a sea anchor and leaving everybody on board would have been much safer than putting people in a life raft. So a sea anchor works really well. And it's back to you.
Thank you very much, Colin. We've had a few questions sort of coming in, so now we'll move on to the Q&A. So we're going to open the floor, so flood us with your questions. We've had a few come in already. I think you've answered that one. Should you run the engine with the sea anchor? No. So with regard to you're out at sea, you've you've heard the forecast of a storm coming through. How should you prep your crew and all that sort of thing? It's not just obviously making the boats prep, but obviously you need to have your crew and everything. Is there anything you can do if you're riding it out, that sort of thing?
Well, I think one of the most important things is have a discussion with them. You will know that what their experience is, and so it's giving them information about that they are going to be safe, and give them confidence in the boat and your abilities, but also keep them busy preparing. So obviously things like life jackets and lifelines and the like. But I didn't get to my port recondition point without having suitable amount of food and hot drinks. So we would fill a flask with hot drinks. We would get plenty of sandwiches made and things like that. And depending on where we are, we might let the Coast Guard know that where we're going and what we're going to do. It could be, for example, if you're going to set a sea anchor, you might want to send out a security message so that other people know that you're there. The last thing you would want is to be run down by a bigger ship. So there are some things that you can do, but certainly the food, plenty of chocolate, and hot drinks. Hot drinks are most important because in bad weather it's always cold.
And in that situation, is it advisable to pump your dinghy up and get your life raft out on deck and all that sort of stuff, or is that for later on, I suppose?
Well, there's a couple of points here, really. I'm not too sure about the dinghy issue because that's going to increase your windage and things like that, and it might get blown away. But the life raft, in my opinion, and it is only my opinion, the life raft should be ready to go at any time. You never know what's going to happen. So obviously if it's a canister life raft on the deck with a hydrostatic release, it's ready to go anyway. The grab bag is probably the more important thing, to have a grab bag and put in the things that you think you want to take: handheld radio, biscuits, liquid for drinking, anything else that you feel, a bigger first aid kit than the one that's in the life raft, anything else that you think you might need. If you're abroad, the passport and plastic cards and things like that might be useful. So it's anything you need in the grab bag should be ready to take. But again, you don't really want to get people too worried, not in the early stages anyway.
And one that's and in that situation, who would you put on the helm? Would you have the skipper, or would you put one of the reliable crew on, or just someone who can keep their mind off what's going on, I suppose?
I would put the best helmsman that you have. It doesn't have to be the skipper. I have a friend. We got caught out in quite a small boat, 29 foot. I say caught out because we were there because of our own stupidity. We had a deadline to meet on a trip from Newcastle down to Burnham-on-Crouch, and when we arrived in Newcastle, they said they were going to close the lock the next day, and my colleague was one of my two colleagues that was with us had to go back to work in 4 days' time. So we checked the forecast, and we knew it was going to get worse, but it wasn't going to get worse for another day and a half. So we decided to go. And with hindsight, we shouldn't have gone. We should have waited until a fortnight, for example, or gone to another harbour just up the river and waited. But we got caught out in a force 9 crossing the Wash, and so it was a classic case of a little tiny bit of storm sail, Genoa, and the engine running, and we were out there for 2 and a bit days. And Andy, my colleague, took the helm for a large part of that, because we had our other crewmate was being seasick nearly all the time. So it's not always the skipper that should be on the helm. You need to manage the whole crew and look after everybody. So it's the best helmsman for the job.
I mean, and do you keep a heavy weather checklist in the chart table or on board or anything? Or
we do. I have to be honest and say we don't always read it, but it is a prompt. So we have one for fog as well. I've been out in fog a couple of times and where we've, believe it or not, forgotten to put the radar on. So it's we have a checklist for fog and bad weather of any type, really.
And so a question that's come in: what with regard to storm boards? What's the sort of best practice on those? Do you carry them on board? When do you deploy them?
We don't carry storm boards. If we were doing a trip across the Atlantic, then we would. We have the locker tops. So we've never had to deploy them, but the locker tops on one of the Sigmas that we have got locating holes so that we can put them over the hatches and put them over the port lights, so they will double up as storm boards. But I've never had to deploy them yet.
And someone else has come in. Could you please explain when you would use a sea anchor from the bow and when you would use a drogue from the stern? Okay,
so a drogue from the stern is to slow you down, so you're still in control of the vessel. You don't want to pitch so that the rudder comes out of the water and you lose steerage way, and then you might broach. So you would put something over the stern to slow you down, whereas a sea anchor, you put it from the bow to keep the bow into the waves and the wind. And because from a stability point of view, if you're sideways onto a breaking wave, then if that breaking wave is the height of your beam, it's going to roll the boat. So you try and hit any big waves forwards. So putting a sea anchor over the bow, the boat's designed to go forwards into the waves. It holds the boat head to wind into the waves. So if you are no longer in control of the vessel, you can't sail, then a sea anchor over the bow and just go downstairs, eat your sandwiches, drink your coffee, and wait.
And another one that's come in: how do you choose where to anchor when running for cover? So how do you choose a good anchor spot when you're trying to shelter?
Okay, so a good anchoring spot is one that is sheltered. So you're behind some land, so that you don't need to look at the chart and try and find a designated anchorage. It's more a case of if we're in survival conditions and you want to protect yourself, you get yourself behind some land. It doesn't really matter too much where it is. You might want to look at the holding. We always carry at least 2 anchors. On my own boat, we have a massive fisherman's anchor, which I was told is very old hat these days. But we have a CQR on the bow, which we use normally on the East Coast. I have a Bruce as a kedge, and then I have a big sea anchor in case, not sea anchor, big fisherman's anchor, which I can use if it's rocky or if there's kelp. But I think in this case, I would just look to find a piece of land that is going to shelter us from the wind.
And another one coming in, Carl, one for you. If you leave port with bad weather forecast, are you still insured? There's a tricky one for you.
Well, it's all about being prudent and seaman-like. So if you knowingly leave port in a storm, then your insurers are going to ask questions because it's reckless. Colin gave an example where he had a weather window and was caught out, that's somewhat different. But if you knowingly leave port with a storm blowing, then that's reckless, and you're not going to get your insurers to look at that too favourably.
Your insurance would certainly ask questions at that point. So yeah, being caught out is all well and good, because that's
a lot different to
actually physically
acknowledge that there is a problem or a storm blowing at that point.
Now back to you, Colin. Could you please describe, this is again coming in from the audience, could you please describe how to use the pipe to stop chafing again?
Okay, so we have a piece of plastic toilet pipe. We haven't cut it off the toilet, so it's a piece of new toilet pipe. And
that's so good to hear.
And around about 300 millimeters long, and we've split it lengthways, so we can open it up and clip it over the warp where it goes through the fair lead, and squash it down, and then we tape it up, just like in the little sketch that I had. We tape it up with some gaff tape. I always take the view that if gaff tape can get Apollo 13 back, then it should be able to get a boat back. So we tape it up with gaff tape, and then it stops the warp chafing either on a cleat or, in particular, if it's going over an anchor roller. Anchor rollers start off nice and round, but when you've got chain and warp going over the top, they always get a groove and get chipped, and then they can really damage the warp dramatically. So piece of plastic pipe's a good solution, really.
And just again, we've mentioned sea anchor, we sort of and a drogue. I mean, they're obviously different bits of kit. The drogue obviously slows you down, but is it in some way similar to the sea anchor in the fact that it's sort of just, but it's obviously
it's just a smaller version. Some people will use a bucket if they've got a nice robust bucket. It's about the size of a bucket usually, and it's just like a little parachute that you drop over the back. Whereas the sea anchor I have on our boats is about 8 foot in diameter. So that's what, two and a bit meters diameter when it's deployed. So much bigger. The other thing is that with a sea anchor in particular, is getting it back on board is really hard work. Some people, in the little sketch, there was a float behind it on a bit of rope. And the idea would be you collect a bit of rope and then pull it in backwards so that it collapses, because they are enormous, and there's a lot of force on them.
And what about the? I mean, a lot of us were taught about heaving too. Would you use that against using or in partnership with using a drogue or a sea anchor, or would you use it as a totally separate thing?
Okay, so heaving too is fine in when the sea is relatively calm, but when you heave to, you're usually sideways onto the wind, and that's where the waves are coming from. So from a stability point of view, if you've got really bad weather, that's going to be an issue where you might be rolled over. So heaving to is good to practice it as an emergency stop. For example, if you lose a man overboard, you may well want to heave to first. But if the weather's really bad, heaving to could be a little bit tricky. So I would be a bit reluctant. If we've reached the point where you're going to put a sea anchor out, that's survival conditions, I think heaving to is going to be a little bit awkward.
And again, someone's asked if you could explain again how would you set up the snubber using both cleats on the bow. Okay,
so you've got the anchor chain you've let the anchor out, you've got it out to how much you want it to go. Get a piece of rope that's, I don't know, 6 or 8 feet long or a bit longer. Put a clove hitch around the chain and then let it out some more, and then you have the piece of rope then either side coming up to both cleats, one either side of the boat. Then tie them off, and then let the chain go slack, and then the weight of the chain is being taken, or the weight of the boat is being taken by the ropes, one either side of the boat, rather than on a traditional snubber, which is usually only one side. I don't know if that's good enough. If not, if someone sends in the question, I can send them a sketch.
Oh, that'd be really kind, because that kind of leads very nicely into my next question: is where can people learn more about all of this sort of stuff, about anchoring in stormy weather and all that sort of stuff?
Well, I'm bound to say, you can always come on and talk with us, but any RYA sailing school will provide some training in anchoring techniques, and I would say perhaps go out for a day, or get an instructor to come on board your boat. I think that's probably more use, actually. Get an instructor to come out on your boat for a day, practice anchoring, and then go out and get confidence in your equipment that you can have confidence that you're safe. It's interesting that lots of people will rather moor to a buoy than anchor. I have quite an entertaining story where we picked up a buoy for lunch on the south coast, and it was very calm weather, and we were enjoying our lunch, and I was looking around, thinking, I don't know, I think we're moving. And when I pulled the rope, the bow line up, the buoy had about 6 foot of chain on it and nothing else. So we'd been drifting for about half an hour. It's a good job it was kind of slack water, pretty much. Whereas if you have your own equipment, you anchor, you can have confidence and know that it's you're going to be safe. And I would, in some ways, I'd prefer to anchor than pick up a buoy. So, because I know the equipment is in good condition and everything else. So, learning how to, the best practice of anchoring, get an instructor to come on board your vessel. I think that would be my advice, and then go out and practice yourself.
I mean, it's one of those age-old things, isn't it? It's the old adage: practice, 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 and
yes,
and do it and if you can practice it when it's calm and it's nice, it'll become more automatic when you actually need it and that sort of thing.
Yes, and I mean, when I'm teaching theory, I often I don't know if there's anybody I've taught on online now, but they will have undoubtedly heard the story that when I was first married, for some reason when you're courting, sailing doesn't come into it that much, really. And but after I first got, well, I say first got married, I've only been married once, but when my wife and I took her sailing for the first time in a dinghy when we were first married, and I was showing off as a young man, and I scared her so much that it was 17 years before she got in a boat with me again. So I would say to anybody, if there's any risk that you looked at your crew and you think they're not going to like it in the weather that we've got coming, just don't go. It will last a long time. The reverberations will last a long time, believe me.
Another question just coming back to the snubber. Some people take the snubber line back to the winches in the cockpit. Is there a benefit of having this length of snubber? And also, what diameter of rope would you suggest for a snubber? That's good.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that depends. The size of the rope depends on the size of your chain, because 8mm chain, for example, you want the rope to go in between, so it crushes between the links, otherwise it won't grip. So we have on 8mm chain, we've got about 10mm rope, I think, or maybe it might be 14, but when it's pulled tight, it goes in between the links. I don't know exactly what size it is, but it might be 14mm actually, I think we've got. Whereas if you had 10mm chain, there's a much bigger gap between the links, and obviously you're in a much bigger boat, so you're going to want something a bit bigger. But it doesn't have to be an enormously big, strong bit of rope, because the pull on the anchor, for example, is not the weight of your boat. So our boat, we've got a Westerly Ocean Quest, and she's about 8.5 tons, I think, and the pull on the rope is only 1,800 pounds on the anchor. So it's not the weight of the boat you're holding; it's the force of the water against the boat. So the rope doesn't have to be that particularly big. It's more a case of will it grip on the chain. So that's that one. I've forgotten the second.
And yeah, the other one was taking the snubber line back to the winches in the cockpit, whether there's benefit to having longer lines for that, or whether there's.
It's a case of necessarily longer lines, actually, but we had on a delivery some years ago, we had to be towed, and we rigged a bridle around all the different cleats, which is a textbook job. And then the RYA, when they came alongside, dropped a man on, he changed it and put them to a winch. And the reason he said they were putting it to the winch, it came around all the cleats, but then up to a winch, was that the winch is designed to take far more load than a cleat. Cleat isn't necessarily designed for towing. It's designed for holding you stable in a marina. So he brought the ropes up to a winch, and the winch is held down with 4 M10 bolts rather than 2 that was on the cleat. So I would say it's not so much the extra stretch, but more the safety of putting it around a winch, because the winch will take the load better.
And I think I'll thank you very much for that. And I think for our last question, I can't see any more. And if you have 2 anchors out in strong winds, will the tide change or wind shift cause a problem or any issues by having 2 anchors out, e.g. crossing chains, all that sort of thing?
Okay, so yes, it will. So we've been in a position where my wife and I, where we put one anchor out behind the other, and when we turned, the boat took probably about 100 meters before it stopped, because the anchor bit in again. Because once it started to turn, instead of having the anchors in line, they were side by side, and so the first anchor started to drag. The momentum then took the second one. I was on deck at the time because we'd set an anchor alarm, well, not an anchor alarm, but an alarm to wake me up, so that when the tide turned, I could be there. And I stopped it by letting more chain out. So, and although you might have all chain, and you've got it all out, you can always add a bit of rope to it to make it longer. If you've got 2 anchors out side by side, like in one of the sketches we showed, that's really for use in a position where there is not a lot of tide, and you're perhaps in the Mediterranean where it's just pretty much just wind, and you're windrowed all the time. And of course, if the wind then changes, the wind is, the storm is probably over. So for a while anyway, so you can make the changes necessary. But if the anchors are laid one behind the other, then yes, there is a risk of it dragging when the tide turns.
Fantastic. I think that's the last question we've had. So it just falls to me now to say thank you very much to everyone for attending. Thank you to Colin and Carl for giving up their very valuable time and going through all this. We hope you all found it very useful and that there are some little nuggets for you to take away and use in the future. But if you do have, obviously, I'll just leave the slide here with all our contact details on, so you can obviously contact us as and when. But Jess, I hope there's some nuggets of information that's been useful to you out there. And thank you all very much for attending.